Let's get to our political panel for the day. Liberal MP Tim Wilson and Labor MP Anne Ali join me now. Let's start with you, Anne Ali. On climate policy, of course, do you agree with Joel Fitzgibbon that Labor should adopt the Coalition's target by 2030 of 28% reduction?
Oh, hello, Tom. How are you? Look, I think Joel is a passionate advocate for his electorate, as we all should be. And I think now is the time for discussion. We're 6 months out of an election defeat. We're looking at reviewing our policies, and he, of course, has a right to say what he wants to say and to put forth his opinions on where we should be headed. However, I do think that Labor will be sticking to its principle of the Paris Agreement and the commitment to the Paris Agreement, which goes against what the government's proposal is about the 28% emissions target. Of course, all of this is in review, and now is the time for discussion with that. And I think that we should be encouraging everyone to have their say at this time.
So just clarifying, you want to stick with Labor's 45% target?
I think that's what Labor will end up sticking with, not the 45% target. As you know, that's all under revision at the moment. But certainly our commitment to the Paris Agreement is
but the Paris obviously is voluntary from countries. Now, when Paris in itself is not on track, but the only commitment Australia has is the Coalition's target. Are you saying it will be 45 or just more than the Coalition's? What are you saying Labor's will be?
I'm not going to put a figure on it, Tom. I'm not going to put a figure on it. That's up to the Cabinet and the caucus based on expert advice and the science. And that's where we're headed. That's the kind of consideration that we're giving to these policies. I'm not about to put a figure or a timeline or preempt what the Cabinet or the caucus is going to come up with.
But is it fair to say you don't agree with Joel Fitzgibbon on going to the Coalition's target?
I think that Joel Fitzgibbon is a passionate advocate for his community, as we all should be. This is something that concerns his electorate, and he's rightly stood up for his electorate. But now is the time that you see Labor will be discussing these issues. That's what we're going through. We're going through a process of review. We're going through a process of discussion. Each member should be standing up for the people who they represent and advocate for the people who they represent.
OK, well, what about your... I know you've spoken about his passion. What about your people then? What do you think they want?
Well, look, I think that climate change is a big issue in Cowan. I've had, just recently, I had a beautiful set of letters from a group of Year Sixes at one of my local schools, and I'll go and visit them and have a chat to them about it. I think there's real anxiety about the fact that climate change is happening and that the government doesn't really have a policy at the moment to actually tackle climate change in any meaningful way. So I'm still talking to my electorate, and I will be continuing to talk to my electorate, and I will advocate for them.
Tim Wilson, I haven't forgotten about you, although your facial expressions were probably doing the talking. I'm not sure if any of them were on screen.
Tom, I'm quite happy for you to go back to Anne because it was so bizarre a conversation. I mean, it's quite simple. Do you support the Coalition's Paris Agreement targets of 26 or 8%, or do you, which is the position Joel Fitzgibbon is arguing for, or do you support Labor's pre-existing position? And I mean, I would have thought it was pretty straightforward. Anne obviously is in one camp or the other, unless she's advocating for an third alternative where there's even greater division with the Labor Party ranks. So it's quite simple. Anne, do you support the Paris target and 26 to 28% target of the Coalition that Joel Fitzgibbon is arguing for?
You're asking the questions now, are you, Tim?
Well, yes, I am. It's a pretty simple question. I support it, by the way, just clarity. There you go.
This is much more complex than what you want me to say. Well, a simple yes or a no, and you know that. And you go out and you talk. Well, I assume you go out and you talk to people in your electorate.
It was actually before the election.
I assume you go out and talk to people in your electorate rather than like take trips to Hong Kong to protest there. So you would know that in your electorate it's a complex issue as well.
It is. But in the end, the target is the target that we're working towards.
But what about
the target? Is a target we're working towards.
Well, the target's only that, though, Tim Wilson, because the Coalition set it, and you also effectively halved it in December 2018 by using carryovers. So do you think there'd be people in your electorate keen for it to be more ambitious?
I think a lot of people want to see us meet that target and to be able to deliver lower emissions while making sure we deliver economic growth, energy reliability and security and affordable electricity prices. And that's the plan. That's why we've set the target at 26 to 28%, because we think we can deliver that and meet that in line, by the way, with the expectations, the emissions targets of other countries. And that's why it's not a straight... Yes, there are a lot of complexities about how you get there, but actually saying that's what you want to achieve and to get there is not actually that complex. Clearly, Anne finds it otherwise.
Well, to be fair, I mean, the Labor Party is at the moment going through plenty of debates on policy. This is one of them. I wanted to talk to you about this march in Hong Kong, Tim Wilson. Pretty rare to see a sitting MP marching in another country over what's happening in Hong Kong. What was your impression of the protest movement, first of all?
Well, my impression of the protest movement is full of a lot of people, mainstream people who are concerned about their future, who obviously want to have a say over the future direction of Hong Kong. I mean, one of the chief requests is to have universal suffrage. And I would have thought, as a Liberal Democrat, particularly when these people are on a front line between two competing worldviews, obviously between the Chinese view of the world and obviously the Western Liberal Democratic side, they're saying they want to support the Western Liberal Democratic side. And, you know, as somebody who supports those values, I support them.
I know there's been a tweet you did from October 2011 getting some attention. I'll read it out for the purpose of our viewers. Walked past Occupy Melbourne protest. All people who think freedom of speech equals freedom to be heard. Time wasters send in the water cannons. I'm not going to focus on the water cannons bit. I know you say that was a joke, but what about the all people who think freedom of speech equals freedom to be heard? What does that mean exactly?
Well, I think it was actually a miscommunication. I mean, this is a tweet that was written when you're walking by the side of the road when people were getting arrested because they've been occupying public land for 2 weeks. And the point was, it doesn't mean that you necessarily, just because you want to say something, doesn't mean people have to listen to you. And that's true. I mean, that's a basic proposition. But, I mean, I just find it bizarre that people keep raising this. We actually have people who are risking their lives in Hong Kong between two competing worldviews, who are standing up for their right to self-determination and because they want Liberal democratic reform. That should actually be the focus. They should be the focus. And I know that some people like to raise these tweets because they think it delegitimises me. That's fine. But it's actually distracting from the very serious issue. And the reason I stood up with that protest amongst, as well as saying, obviously, I support the broader ambition of what it's trying to achieve, is because one of the things that's stopping violence and crackdown on protests from standing up for Liberal democratic reform is global attention in making sure that people know, particularly the CCP, what people that the world is watching. And that's what we should be focusing on.
Well, yeah, and we have focused a lot on the protests themselves, extensively on the program.
Keep focusing on it.
And we will. I was just curious about that freedom to be heard. As you say, it was a miscommunication, but saying you don't have to listen to people, I suppose that's true. Logical in of itself. Anne Ali, you were engaging in some interesting facial expressions. I'm having quite the program in that regard there. What are your thoughts on what you've heard from Tim Wilson?
Well, you know, Tim's a big boy and he can make his own decisions, but personally, I don't think that members of parliament should be attending protests in other countries without a full awareness of.
Funny, you can provide a very clear answer on
this,
Anne.
Tim.
You can provide a very clear answer on this. 26, 28 or 45?
Keep going.
Well, let's
keep going. So do you? So what? So I could turn that around and say to you, Tim, do you support peaceful protest or not? Because in 2011. You wanted to bring out water cannons.
Actually, it wasn't a peaceful protest.
For other people, but not for Australians? So you support peaceful protest and you'll go and protest with other countries, but not for Australians? But that's beside the point.
And it wasn't a peaceful protest. That's part of the point.
You can make your own
In fact, there was allegations of sexual violence within the protest.
You're a big boy. You can make your own decisions, Tim. But like I said, in my personal opinion, I think it's unwise.
One of the other issues, are you saying that was the only issue with Occupy Melbourne? I mean, obviously it was some of those protests were deliberately aiming to disrupt the city and, well, Hong Kong's economy is clearly hurting from the protests going on there. Is there not a parallel?
It's not everybody believes, well, I hope everybody believes in people's right to protest. And of course, it has to be done in compliance with laws. So where people commit acts of violence, I condemn them. I don't condone, destruction of personal property. When you want to disrupt the city, you've obviously got to do things like work with local police officials and yada yada yada.
Do you condone water cannons?
But the difference between this one and that one is that these people had been protesting for 2 weeks in a singular space, had occupied us. The whole point was it was an occupation. It wasn't just an ordinary protest. And again, I'd like to be focusing on what's happening in Hong Kong, but if you want to keep rehashing what happened in 2011 and the occupation movement and what was designed behind it, go free. But I don't think you're doing anybody any favours.
I wanted to get one final topic. This is from the Press Club today, a debate around these religious discrimination laws. Church-run organisations, well, we heard from Martin Illis today that he would be very comfortable if there was legal protection to sack workers just for being gay under these new laws. And we heard as well from Fiona Patton that she believes this would be the case with these laws. Would this be a red line for you, Tim Wilson?
Well, that's not the nature of these laws. The Religious Discrimination Act is designed to stop people experiencing discrimination on the basis of their faith. So people are actually talking about the Sex Discrimination Act, which is a different piece of legislation which is currently being reviewed by the Australian Law Reform Commission, and I'm waiting to see very keenly what comes out of that inquiry.
But in either case, if there's any right to do that, then you would have an issue with that?
Well, firstly, just for clarity, that's actually the current law under the Sex Discrimination Act. And yes, I do have some deep concerns about that component of the existing law that's currently being reviewed by the Australian Law Reform Commission. And it's not part of the discussion under the current proposal as part of the Religious Discrimination Act being put forward by Christian Porter.
Right, but you'd have an issue with it. Anna Lee, your thoughts on this?
Look, I think it's important that people who have the opportunity to make a submission into the draft bill do that and have their say with that. From my personal perspective, I think it's important that we have a definition of religious discrimination, both direct and indirect. However, the rest of the bill is a little bit of a mishmash, I think, and doesn't really hit the mark. But as I said, I'd encourage people who have an opinion to make a submission to the review now while the draft is up there for commentary.
I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to ask you one final question, Tim Wilson. We've had a warning on quantitative easing from Warwick McKibben. This is the drastic step the RBA is thinking of taking. Should the RBA need to consult in some way before pulling this trigger?
What they've said is that they would consider it to be an extreme measure, but it would be prudent to consider. I think it is an extreme measure. I don't even think it's prudent to consider. And yes, I think they should be consulting, obviously, with the government, but also they should be consulting with the House Economics Committee, who they come and report to, because quantitative easing is a very economically dangerous step. That is to be, or potentially a very volatile step that they're seeking to take. And
so they should check with the government. Is it a permission thing or is it a consultation thing before they do this?
I think it's a credibility of the Australian economy thing.
But what does that mean they would actually need to do?
But what that means is that it'll have a very dramatic impact on things like the integrity of the dollar.
Yeah, but what they have to do when you say they should check, is it just a consultation thing?
Well, they're obviously set up with an independent mandate. They are entitled to do as they see fit, but to not do it in firstly, to not do it in consultation with the government, I think would be madness on their part, and I think that they wouldn't do that. But I think it would have to be part of a very robust discussion for the Australian economy.
All right, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for going over, but this was another robust discussion. Tim Wilson, Anna Lee, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Tom. But I'm happy to say 26 to 28%.
There you go. Always gets the last word.